So why do we have the Electoral College anyway? So to answer that question, I think we should look at Federalist number 10, which is one of the essays that was written by James Madison as part of the larger series of essays called the Federalist Papers, which were written by founding fathers who wanted to have the Constitution as opposed to the Articles of Confederation, which is what the U.S. was governed under after the Revolutionary War. And then after that, we switched eventually to the Constitution. And the Federalist Papers are arguing in favor of the Constitution, and Federalist 10 in specific is James Madison's justification and reasoning for why he thought that we should have the Electoral College. So let's have a look at this. Skip that part. Number 10 addresses how to reconcile citizens with interests contrary to the rights of others or inimical to the interests of the community as a whole. Madison saw factions as inevitable due to the nature of man. That is, as long as people hold differing opinions, having differing amounts of wealth, and own differing amounts of property, they will continue to form alliances with people who are most similar to them, and they will sometimes work against the public interest and infringe upon the rights of others. He thus questions how to guard against those dangers. Federalist number 10 continues the theme begun in Federalist 9 and is titled The Utility of the Union as a Safeguard Against Domestic Faction and Insurrection. The whole series is cited by scholars and jurists as an authoritative interpretation and explication of the meaning of the Constitution. Historians such as Charles A. Beard argued that number 10 shows an explicit rejection by the Founding Fathers of the principles of direct democracy and factionalism, remember that, and argued that Madison suggests that a representative government is more effective than partisanship and factionalism. Madison saw the federal constitution as providing for a happy combination of a republic and a pure democracy, with the great and aggregate interests of referring to the national, the local, and particularly to the state legislators, resulting in a decentralized governmental structure. In his view, this would make it more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried. We don't need to read all of this, obviously. I just want to get to the most important sections that I think here. And by the way, you can read the whole Federalist paper right here, archives on archives.gov. You can see how it's quite long. I have read it myself. I encourage you to do so too, but it's quite a lot of reading to do in a video. But have a look at it yourself. I'm going to summarize it. So talk about the question of faction. When he says faction, he essentially means like different interests in society, interests that will inevitably form political parties and advocate towards what they want. And Federalist 10 continues the discussion of the question broached in Hamilton's Federalist 9. Hamilton there addressed the destructive role of a faction in breaking apart the Republic. The question Madison answers then is how to eliminate the negative effects of faction. Madison defines a faction as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a minority or majority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. He identifies the most serious source of faction to be the diversity of opinion in political life, which leads to dispute over fundamental issues such as what regime or religion should be preferred. Madison argues the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Providing some examples of distinct interest, Hamilton identified a landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, and many lesser interests. Madison insists that they all belong to different classes that are actuated by different sentiments and views. Thus, Madison argues those different classes would be prone to make decisions in their own interest, not for the public good. A law regarding private debts, for instance, would be a question to which the creditors and parties on one side and the debtors on the other. To this question, and many others like it, Hamilton notes, though justice ought to hold the balance between them, the interested parties would reach different conclusions, neither with sole regard to justice and public good. Like the anti-federalists opposed to him, Madison was substantially influenced by the works of Montesquieu, though Madison and Montesquieu disagreed on the question addressed in the essay. He also relied heavily on philosophers such as Scottish Enlightenment, of the Scottish Enlightenment, especially David Hume, whose influence is most clear in Hamilton's discussion of the types of faction and his argument for extended republic. So essentially what he's saying is that societies have factions or parties or just various interests that all seek to wish to have their issues and grievances addressed, and how this is a source of conflict in society. And so this is, okay, so he identifies faction as a problem, and then some of the arguments, I'm not going to do all of these, but some of the arguments that he makes from these are, Madison first theorizes that there are two ways to limit the damage caused by faction, either to remove the cause of faction or to control its effects. He then describes two methods to remove the cause of faction. First, by destroying liberty, which obviously is not going to work because you just fought a revolution for liberty, and you can't remove that cause of faction. The second option, creating a society homogenous in opinions and interests, is impractical. The diversity of people's abilities is what makes them succeed more and more or less, and inequality of poverty is a right that the government should protect. So obviously we're not going to all agree on everything in society. Society always has different opinions. So essentially you cannot control the cause of faction, but perhaps maybe we can address and find some solutions here. He then argues that the only problem comes from the majority of factions because the principle of popular sovereignty should prevent minority factions from gaining power. Madison offers two ways to check the majority factions, to prevent the existence of some passion or interest in the majority at the same time, or to render a majority faction unable to act. He concludes a small democracy cannot avoid the dangers of majority faction because small size means undesirable passions can very easily spread to the majority of the people, and then will enact its will through the democratic government with difficulty. Also up here, I think is what I meant to say earlier, Madison concludes, so since we can't control the cause of faction, Madison concludes that the damage caused by faction can be limited by controlling its effects. So you can control the effect of faction, but you can't actually stop faction from occurring in society. Madison states, the latent cause of faction are thus known to sow in the nature of man, and so it's curious to control the effects. He makes an argument on how this is not possible in a pure democracy, but possible in a republic. So here, distinction between democracy and republic, but when they mean democracy in this context, they mean direct democracy. Because after all, a republic is a type of democracy, but when he says democracy in this context, he means direct democracy. With a pure democracy / direct democracy, it means a system in which every citizen votes directly for laws, direct democracy. And with a republic, he intends a society in which citizens elect a small body of representatives who then vote for laws, representative democracy. He indicates that the voice of the people pronounced by a body of representatives is more comfortable to the interest of the community, since, again, people's comment and decisions are affected by their self-interest. So what he's saying is that in order to control some of the negative effects of faction, you have a representative democracy, essentially, rather than a direct democracy. And so what he's sort of arguing for is a way of controlling for, he wants people to be empowered to make their own decisions and with their own votes, but he also wants, representatives who then represent those people. And so the same way, the way that Congress works, essentially, but he's also kind of applying this to presidential elections, additionally. A republic, Madison writes, is different from a democracy because its government is placed in the hands of delegates or electors, and as a result of this, it can be extended over a larger area. The idea is that in a large republic, there will be more fit characters to choose from for each delegate. Also, the fact that each representative is chosen from a larger constituency should make the vicious arts of electioneering less effective. For instance, in a large republic, a corrupt delegate would need to bribe many people in order to win an election than in a smaller republic. Also, in a republic, delegates both filter and refine the many demands of the people so as to prevent the type of frivolous claim that impede purely democratic governments. So, though Madison argued for a large and diverse republic, the writers of the Federalist Papers recognized the need for balance. They wanted a republic diverse enough to prevent faction, but with enough commonality to maintain cohesion among the states. And I think this is a very key thing. A lot of the Constitution was built on compromise between different people who had different ideas about how the government should work. They want a republic diverse enough to prevent faction, but with representatives, but with enough commonality to maintain cohesion among the states, so people voting and then states having their powers too. And let's read this short article. This is from history.com. Why was the Electoral College created? The Founding Fathers had to compromise when it came to devising a system to elect the president. This is pretty short, so I think we'll read most of this. So this is 5 times in history, presidential candidates won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. Among the many thorny questions debated by the delegates in the 1787 Constitutional Convention was one of the hardest to resolve as how to elect the president. The Founding Fathers debated for months, with some arguing that Congress should pick the presidents and others insisting on a democratic popular vote. So these are the different ideas that are kind of colliding here, and the Electoral College is a compromise of these ideas. Oh, look, that's what I just said. Hopefully that's not a Getty Images. I guess it's not. How does the Electoral College work? The system calls for the creation every 4 years of a temporary group of electors to the total number of representatives in Congress. Technically, it is these electors, and not the American people, who vote for the president. In modern elections, the first candidate to get to 270 of the 530 electoral votes wins the White House. So I kind of talked about this in my last video. The Electoral College was never intended to be a perfect system for picking presidents, says George Edwards III, emeritus political science professor at Texas A&M University. It wasn't like the fathers said, hey, what a great idea. This is the preferred way to select a chief executive, period, says Edwards. They were tired, impatient, and frustrated. They cobbled together this plan because they couldn't agree on anything else. Yeah, it was compromised. That's how it happened. So why was it created? At the time of the Philadelphia Convention, no other country in the world directly elected its chief executive. So honestly, we were ahead of the curve back then. Like, it really was a kind of a groundbreaking thing. So the delegates were weighted into uncharted territory. Further complicating the task was a deep-rooted distrust of executive power because we just fought a monarch. After all, the fledgling nation had just found its way out from under a tyrannical king overreaching colonial governors. They didn't want another despot on their hands. One group of delegates felt strongly that Congress shouldn't have anything to do with picking the president. Too much opportunity for chummy cooperation between the executive and legislative branches. Another camp was dead set against letting the people elect a president by a straight popular vote. First, they thought the 18th century lawmakers lacked the resources to be fully informed about the candidates, especially in rural outposts, which I guess that is fair. Communication traveled super slowly back then. Second, and pay attention here, they feared a headstrong democratic mob steering the country astray, like someone taking advantage of the masses and using populism to appeal to people who don't know what's good for the country. And third, a populist president appealing directly to these people who would command dangerous amounts of power. Well, I mean, I'm literally saying it before I even read it. Out of the drawn-out debates came a compromise based on the idea of electoral intermediaries. These intermediaries wouldn't be picked by Congress or elected by the people. Instead, the states would appoint independent electors who would cast the actual ballots for presidency, yes. So slavery and the Three-Fifths Compromise, I think we can skip this a little bit, but essentially the idea is the southern states have slavery. They want slaves to be represented because being a representative means they have, even though slaves can't vote, of course, they don't have any rights, but they get, by them having representatives in the House of Representatives, it gives the southern states more power. The northern states didn't want slaves to be represented because they don't have rights. So why are they even represented? And because that it's beneficial to the north to for the southern states to have less power. So that instead, another compromise they came up with was the Three-Fifths Compromise, where if slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Not only was the creation of the Electoral College in part a political workaround for the persistence of slavery in the United States, yes it was, that was one of the first major contentions we had, but almost none of the Founding Fathers' assumptions about the electoral system proved true. For starters, there were no political parties in 1787. The drafters of the Constitution assumed that electors would vote according to the individual discretion, not to the dictates of the state or party. Today, most electors are bound to vote for their party's candidate. So yeah, a lot of states have faithful elector laws where the elector has to vote for whichever candidate won the state. But the founders saw the electors as being informed by people's votes, but not necessarily bound by people's votes. They could still change who they gave their electoral votes to, even if it wasn't what the people wanted, because they would know what was best because of their education. And even more important, the Constitution says nothing about how the states should allocate or allot their electoral votes. The assumption was that each elector's vote would be counted, but over time, all but 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, passed laws to give all of their electoral votes to the candidate who wins the state's popular vote count, first past the post. Any semblance of electoral independence has been fully wiped out. The founders also assumed that most elections would ultimately be decided by neither the people nor the electors, but by the House of Representatives, according to the Constitution. If no single candidate wins a majority of the electoral votes, the decision goes to the House, where each state gets a vote. So they honestly didn't even think that, they thought that people wouldn't typically win the presidency by getting a majority of electoral votes. They thought it would be the House that decides, which they got that completely wrong. After the unanimous election of George Washington as the nation's first president, the founders figured that consequent elections would feature tons of candidates, yeah, I wish, who would divide up the electoral pie into chunks, giving Congress a chance to pick the winner. But as soon as national politics formed, the number of presidential candidates shrunk. Only 2 U.S. elections have been decided by the House, and the last one is 1824. So why do we still use it? So why does it still exist despite its contentious origins and awkward fit into modern politics? Because the party in power typically benefits from the existence of the Electoral College, also because it's really hard to change the Constitution, although if you want to see a way around the Electoral College to get a popular vote to decide the president, see my previous video. And the minority party has little chance of changing the system because a constitutional amendment requires a 2/3 majority in Congress plus ratification by 3/4 of states. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Here we can read a little bit. Obviously, I'm not going to read all this. Plus, it is written in like 1700s English. I mean, it's modern enough, but it is a bit antiquated in how it comes across. I guess I'll read the part where he's talking about faction. By a faction, and these are the words of James Madison. By faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent aggregate interests of the community. There are 2 methods of curing the mischiefs of faction. The one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. So this is just what we read from Wikipedia. There are, again, 2 methods of removing the cause of faction. One by destroying liberty, which is essential to its existence. The other by giving every citizen the same opinions, passions, and interests, which is not at all true. And so this is, again, what we read on Wikipedia. I do think it's good to read some clips of this, just so you can see the original language here. And I guess I'll read this last paragraph. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy, again, by democracy he means direct democracy, by republic he means representative democracy, in controlling the effects of faction, it is enjoyed by a large over a small republic. It is enjoyed by the union of states composing it. Does this advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudices and schemes of injustice? It will not be denied that the representation of the union will be most likely to possess these requisite endowments. Does it consist in the greater security afforded by a greater variety of parties against the event of any one party being able to outnumber and oppress the rest? In an equal degree, does not increased variety of parties comprised within the union increased in security, the security, does it, in fine, consist of the greater obstacles opposed to the concert and accomplishment of the secret wishes of an unjust and interested majority? Here again, the extent of the union gives its most palatable advantage. I think that's enough. I think you guys kind of get the idea. Maybe I should have zoomed in a little bit more. That's the idea of why the Electoral College was created. For one, it was just a compromise between founding fathers who had different ideas of direct democracy versus representatives selecting presidents, and it was also because it was designed to prevent a demagogue type of candidate who would use like populism to his own advantage, who would rile up the masses and get them to vote because they thought that it would be a good idea when actually they were voting for someone who was bad for the country. And in an ironic, and let's not forget in the 2016 election, Trump won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. So 304 electoral votes to Hillary Clinton's 227, even though Hillary Clinton had like 3 million more popular votes for president. And ironically, the Electoral College was designed to prevent someone like Trump from taking office, but it actually, in 2016, caused Trump to take office. So perhaps it maybe is a bit of an antiquated system. And if you want to find a way of getting around the Electoral College without having to amend the Constitution, check out my video on the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact.